So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here, and this is another episode of Backroads, Arizona. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to replace the front A-arms on a 2019 Turbo Velocity S XP4 RZR. And even if you don't have this exact same year or model of RZR, the concept's pretty much the same for any RZR. Regular travel, long travel, 2-seater, 4-seater, really doesn't matter. So since I've got so much information in this video, guys, and it is pretty long, I did do a chapter index for you to give you guys the times that I talk about each item so you can bypass it what you don't need to see so I don't waste your time. So let's get to it. So the reason I actually are replacing these A-arms is because I bent my right lower A-arm. I bent my A-arm going to the dunes with some guys with some long travel sand rails, and I tried following the same lines that they were taking at the dunes. This ended up being a bad idea. So I was following one of the cars and they went over the top of a dune at a pretty high speed. I had already gotten stuck earlier that day, so I took it even faster because I did not want to get high centered. And I went over the top of that dune, and there was a witch's eye right on the other side, and I nosedived into that witch's eye and hit the right front tire. This bent my lower A-arm on the right hand side, buckled it. Instead of getting out and taking a look at the front end, which is what I should have done, I didn't want to hinder those guys anymore, so I just started going again, not realizing that it had bent the A-arm, and I had to make a left-hand turn. I turned left. What had happened is the lower A-arm got caught on the sway bar and would not let me go back straight. So I was locked in a left-hand turn and went over on my side and then on my top. Now, in all actuality, I think it could have been a lot worse on the car and on us, but my twisted alloy roll cage held up great. Dented the roof a little bit, but the actual roll cage itself is still in perfect condition, so I'm really impressed with it, and I feel very safe with me and my family in this car. However, after this happened, I decided I would like to upgrade to a long travel car for the dunes as well, and I did purchase a rolling chassis that I got off of Craigslist, and that will be a series of videos that is going to come up on my channel as well. But irregardless of that, let's get to replacing these A-arms. Here's a quick view of all the tools that I used to do this project. The only thing that's missing is an impact, a pair of snap ring pliers, and the tool that I used to press in the ball joints. So right here, I'm just getting it jacked up and put on jack stands. You want to make sure you are very secure on the jack stands because you will be muscling some stuff around and possibly having to smack some things with a hammer, and you do not want it shifting or falling. It would almost be better to do one side at a time. The only reason I am doing both is because I do have proper jack stands to stick under it. And even though I have jack stands underneath it, I went ahead and left my jack with a little bit of pressure on it as well. And since I'm taking the tires and wheels off anyways, I went ahead and stuck them under the frame, so if everything slips, I'm still going to have about 10 inches, and it's not going to allow it to fall all the way to the ground in case I am underneath it. Now, I ended up getting a full set of upper and lower A-arms, even though the only one that was bent was my right lower, because Super ATV only sells them as a set. For the long travel suspension, for the regular travel suspension, they do sell the lowers separate from the uppers. Go figure. However, I did get all four with a lifetime warranty for $200 more than I would have paid for the one lower through Polaris. So one thing I did that I don't even know if it's necessary is I put a strap from my coil spring up around the top of the shock and then back to the coil spring to help keep it collapsed a little bit. It's actually a good idea to do this before jacking it up and taking the tires and wheels off, and that way your spring is already collapsed a little bit from the weight of the vehicle. I actually forgot to hit record, and that's why I did not get a video of this part of the process. So all I did is hook on the bottom of the spring, go up over the top of the shock, and then hook on the other side of the spring, and then strap it down. So originally when I put this ratchet strap on here, the hook was in this slot. During the process of replacing these A-arms, it actually slid up the coil spring a little bit, which made it an absolute pain in the ass to get it off at the end of this project. So if you do decide to do this, I would put it on the second coil. So therefore, if it slips a little bit, it's not going to matter. You're still going to be able to get it off when you're done with this. So the other side I did stayed directly in that groove and came off just fine when it was all said and done. I don't know why this one slipped up. I do think that having these shocks collapsed a little bit did help make the A-arm replacement go a little easier. However, is it absolutely necessary? Probably not. Then using another ratchet strap, I held the upper A-arm and went to the frame of the RZR to pull a little tension up on the upper A-arm to make sure I was loose and could pull the bolts off of the lower A-arm. I removed the bolt that holds the ball joint in place with a 15mm socket and wrench. I also had to remove the caliper because the head of the bolt for the ball joint was hitting those bolts and I could not get them out. I removed that, pulled the caliper out of the way, and then was able to use my impact to unthread that bolt out of the ball joint. Then I just used a pry bar. You can also do it by hand to just pry out the lower ball joint. During this process, if you feel any pressure on that lower ball joint, you are not supported good enough and you need to readdress the way you are holding the spring and the upper A-arm. I cannot stress how critical that is. Make sure you do not have your hands or arms in any position where they could get pinched if something is under load and it pops. Once that ball joint is removed out of the spindle, then I went ahead and loosened and removed the bolts for the A-arm where they attach to the frame. This took an 18mm socket and wrench. I was able to do a couple of them with the impact. I did have to break a couple free with a 1/2-inch ratchet before using the impact to unthread them the rest of the way. I had a hard time getting a wrench on the nut on this one, so I actually just leveraged my pry bar against the frame to hold the nut while I backed off the bolt with my impact. If you cannot remove the bolt by hand and it has a little bit of tension on it, sometimes you can use an impact to unthread the bolt, or use a wrench against the head of the bolt and then use the impact to unthread it as you put a little bit of pressure on the head of that bolt. And that's all there is to removing your lower A-arms, and the sequence is the exact same for the other side. Now let's remove the upper A-arms. The first thing I did was pull out the front part of the grill. There was 2 Torx screws holding this. Now, being as though I put an aftermarket bumper, I could not pull it completely off, but I just shifted it side to side so I could get to the upper A-arm nut. I went ahead and removed the bolt holding the spring to the upper A-arm. This is another one that is very critical. You want to make sure there is not too much tension on that bolt as you go to remove it. It should unthread or pull out pretty easily. If it does not, that means that spring has got a lot of tension on that A-arm and you need to relieve that tension before trying to pull it out. Then I removed the bolt that holds the sway bar link to the upper A-arm. So one of the things that's kind of annoying about the upper A-arms is the brake line is riveted to the A-arm instead of using bolts or screws. So I had to drill those rivets out, and there was a total of 4 of them. You want to pick a drill bit size that's the same size as the hole that is in the A-arm. My drill bit was a little small, and that's why I'm kind of walking it around to get it to break free. Then I lifted the caliper up and set it on a bench out of the way. After getting that out of the way, I went ahead and took the upper ball joint retaining bolt out, then lifted the upper A-arm out of the spindle. Then I removed the bolts that hold the upper A-arm to the frame. The front one, because I took that grill piece off, I was able to get a wrench on that side and use my impact on the back side. I used a brass punch to tap the bolt through a little bit so I could get the wrench on it and use the impact to pull that bolt off. On the back bolt, I had to use a wrench with a ratcheting wrench to remove the bolt because I could not get the impact on it. To remove this upper bolt, you will need to steer all the way to the left. That will allow you to pull the bolt past the steering boot. So now we're going to install the ball joints in the new A-arms. I put the ball joints in the freezer because the colder they are, it actually shrinks them just a little bit and will make them easier to install into the A-arm. So I have a ball joint removal installation kit that I use to put these in. If you don't, you can rent one from an automotive store. Or if you get the A-arms through Super ATV, they do have an option of pre-installed ball joints as well. So when installing ball joints, you want to press on the outside edge of the ball joint, not directly in the center, because the outside edge is a lot stronger. Here's a view from the other side doing the install. I did not have the right size bushing in the kit, so I ended up using a socket. So the top of that C-clamp actually fit perfect over that ball joint on the outer edge to press it into place. Then I used that socket to allow the shaft of the ball joint to press all the way in without hitting the threaded part of the C-clamp. You'll notice the bronze colored substance on the threads of the tool. That is anti-seize, and it's an absolute must in any tool like this because it keeps the threads of the tool from getting hot. And if you do not have that on there, there's a good chance you will gald the threads and completely destroy the tool. You're going to use that tool to press that ball joint all the way in until you can see the groove for the snap ring, basically bottoming it out in the A-arm. You will also need a pair of snap ring pliers to put the snap ring in place in the groove on the ball joint to hold it in place. The gap between the snap ring should be the same distance before you install it as it is after you install it. So if it's not, you can take a hammer and a screwdriver and lightly tap the snap ring to push it down into position. Once I got all the ball joints in the A-arms, it was time to go ahead and get the bushings put in the A-arms. The bushings that came with these A-arms were made of UHMW material, which is self-lubricating and therefore does not require any extra lubricant. However, I did use a little bit of grease to make them slide into place easier. So 2 recommended greases for a poly-based material is lithium or silicone. I had some leftover CV boot grease, and that is lithium-based. Once you get the bushings put in place, there is internal snap rings that you just basically push down and make sure they snap into the groove on the A-arm. I used a flathead screwdriver to assist in pushing them into place. You're going to want to insert the one end in and then either go clockwise or counterclockwise with it and work it down into the groove. And once again, the gap between the snap rings should be the same before and after you install it. That is why I'm using this screwdriver and a light hammer to tap it down into place. Once getting all the bushings held in, then you have to put the end caps on. I found the best way was with a big pair of channel locks. Just hold the 2 ends on and then squeeze them together with the channel locks. I did try using a rubber mallet, but they just kept popping out, and this was by far the easiest way to do this. I did lubricate the O-rings a little bit to help them pop down into place. On the longer A-arm end, the bushing is separate of the end caps. On the shorter ones, the bushing is part of the end cap. One side of the cap has more of a straight cut, the other side has more of a tapered cut. Make sure you put the tapered cut to the outside of the bushings. There's also grease certs to put in the long sleeves on the A-arms. I ended up putting the 90-degree angle one on the upper A-arm and the straight one on the bottom A-arm. I would make sure you put these grease certs on the A-arms before installing them. It makes it a lot easier. You want these to be pretty snug so they hold themselves in an easy position so you can grease it. Mine were either too tight or too loose, so I ended up putting a small washer, and that way it bottomed out on the washer in the position that it was easy to grease. Now we are ready to put the A-arms back on the RZR. I used an extra bungee to hold the spring up out of my way just to make it easier to get these A-arms in place. You might have to use a rubber mallet and just kind of wiggle them around to get them so they slide up into the frame brackets. Don't worry about trying to get them both to line up at the same time. Just get it where you can get one bolt started and in, because then it makes it easier to leverage it around to get the second bolt started. Remember to steer the wheel all the way to the left because we are installing the upper left rear hanger bolt, and that allows you to get that bolt past the steering boot. You do want to be gentle putting that one in, so you make sure you do not rip that steering boot, but I did not have a problem on either side. I got the nut started on that one and then proceeded to get the front bolt in and got the nut started on it as well. I did use blue Loctite pretty much on everything going back together to give it a little bit of extra holding strength. Using that ratcheting wrench and a regular wrench, I tightened down the rear upper bolt. Then I used my impact with an extension and a swivel to tighten down the front and held the front nut with a wrench. You bottom all these bolts out nice and tight because everything is made to swivel, so you don't have to worry about over tightening the bolts. Then I put the sway bar bolt through and tightened it down, once again bottoming it out. Then I let the spring down and got the bolt started from the spring to the upper A-arm and tightened that down as well. When pressing the ball joints into the A-arm, I should have paid more attention to the timing of the ball joint, because there is a slot in the ball joint for the bolt to go through, but you can use a pair of channel locks if you're not timed correctly and swivel it into position. I removed the strap that I had holding the spindle so I could slide it up onto the ball joint. If you're having a hard time getting the slot in the ball joint to line up so you can put the bolt through, you might be able to have somebody turn the steering wheel a little bit to help you out. Then I went ahead and tightened it down with the impact. That's all we're going to do with the upper A-arm for now. We're going to install the lower A-arm. So I slid it up into place and started the bolts pretty much the same as the top. Then went ahead and snugged them down with the impact. On the rear lower bolt, because of my Super ATV skid plate, we had to use a pry bar to pry the skid plate down a little bit so I could get the wrench on it so I could tighten that one down. Once you tighten those down, all you have to do is slide the lower ball joint up into position. You might need to use a rubber mallet to kind of pop the ball joint around to get the right angle, or to tap on the bottom of the A-arm to get it up into place. Then get the bolt started and tighten it down. Then we're going to go ahead and slide the caliper up into place. Make sure you spread the pads apart from each other so you can get it over the rotor. While putting your caliper in place, make sure your brake line did not get twisted. It should not be necessary, but if you have to, for whatever reason you accidentally stepped on the brake when the caliper was off, you could put a pry bar or a large flathead screwdriver between the pads and collapse the caliper a little bit to make it easier to get over the rotor. Then get your bolts started and tighten them down. Once again, I used Loctite on these because I did not want them to come loose. Then all that's left to do is secure the brake line. I wasn't too fond of the plastic clips that they gave me from Super ATV, so I decided to reuse the ones that came on the RZR. However, I had to adjust some of them, and there was glue holding the rubber to the line, so I had to pry those loose. I used a screwdriver in between to spread the clamp so I could get it off, and then leverage the rubber to break the silicone free that was holding it. Then I put the clamp back over the top and squeezed it with a pair of pliers to get it back tight so I could secure it to the A-arm. I did end up shaving down the little dimple on the clamp so it would sit better when it was tightened down against the A-arm. I only had to do that on one or two of them. On the rest of them, that dimple actually seemed to help and might keep them from twisting in the future. That's going to about wrap it up for the installation of these A-arms, guys. I am going to post another video of me installing the other side at the end of this video, just giving you a different angle of the install, but I'm not going to go through an explanation of it again. This is one of the grease zerts that I forgot to put in. These ones weren't bad to install because they were straight and you didn't have to time them. Once you get both sets of A-arms installed, you can go ahead and put the grill cover back on. It snaps in on the top, and then there are two screws that hold it in the bottom. After that, I went ahead and put the tires and wheels back on the front and tighten those down in a star pattern. I actually put some anti-seize on all the threads as well because I changed these out quite a bit between the sand tires and the off-road tires. I use my impact to tighten these down. However, if you want to torque them to spec, it is 120 foot-pounds. Then I jacked it up, pulled the jack stands, and let it settle to the ground. I did move the RZR a little bit to help settle the suspension before pulling the ratchet straps off of the springs. This is the side that came right off without a problem because it did not slip up the spring at all. However, the side that had slipped up and was caught between the aluminum housing and the coil spring required a couple extra ratchet straps, some pry bars, a bunch of cuss words, and an extra 20 minutes of my time to get it off of there. After getting both of those off, I went ahead and took it around the block a couple times, accelerated hard and braked hard to completely settle out the suspension. The lower A-arms from Super ATV have an adjustable joint to adjust your camber. I kind of left them where they sent them to me because they looked really close. You can see right here that I have a little bit of a positive camber, meaning the top of the tire is sticking out to the side more than the bottom. Since I had already had it all together, I went ahead and tightened down the lock nuts and decided I'd go for a little ride just to see how it feels and see if the suspension would settle any more before making the adjustment. I did go on that ride, and that was the squirreliest this RZR has ever been. Positive camber is definitely not the way you want to go as far as the adjustment on this. So I did bring it back, and I'm going to show you how I made that adjustment. So what I ended up using to check the camber adjustment was just a long level, and basically I put it on the side of my tire, top to bottom, to see how far out top to bottom I was. So my final adjustment ended up being just a slight negative camber, because a little bit of negative camber is good for high-speed cornering. So I did have the benefit of an overhead crane, so all I did was wrap it around the spring mount, or the bottom part of the spring, and lifted the weight off of the RZR and off of the lower A-arm. Then I unbolted the 2 bolts that attached the lower A-arm to the frame. I broke loose the lock nuts for that adjustment before taking the bolts out. Then I was able to leverage the bottom of the tire out enough where I could make that adjustment without having to unbolt anything else or removing the A-arm. So since the top of my tires were sticking out further than the bottom, I needed to lengthen the lower A-arms, so I unthreaded them to make them longer. This was a little bit of a guessing game with how much to unthread them. The first time I did it, I actually went too much. But basically I would just make an adjustment, put the bolts back in temporarily. I would put the nuts on, but I wouldn't bother tightening them down, because all I was going to do is lower it down, go up and down the driveway once to settle the suspension, and then recheck my adjustment. To make the adjustment on the rear lower A-arm, I had to turn the end 90 degrees to get it down where I could rotate it 360. Then put it back vertical to get it up into position, and then turn it horizontal to put the bolt in and tighten it down. So honestly, the reason I went for that ride beforehand is I did want to see what positive camber would feel like, which is garbage. The other reason was I just thought it was going to be a nightmare to do this adjustment, and in all actuality it wasn't that bad. Now the overhead crane made it go a lot faster, but just using a jack and jacking it up between the adjustments I guess wouldn't be that bad either. Now I've seen guys trying to make this adjustment with it up on the lift, and I really don't see how that's possible. You could get a baseline doing it that way, but as the weight gets put on the suspension, it's going to change your camber angle. So my mistake in this process was not measuring my old A-arm. The main reason for this is one was so tweaked that there's no way I could get a measurement on it, but I could have measured the other side and went off of that to get a baseline to start at for both sides. Once I got the adjustment the way I was happy with it, I just went under there and tightened the 2 bolts holding the A-arm to the frame and tightened the lock nut on the adjustable joint. Now I did use that long level to set this. There's probably more technical tools to do that, but I feel for the application and what I was doing, that worked just fine. I did go for a ride with that negative camber, and it was way more stable than what it was with the positive camber. Now for normal trail riding, there's no need to probably do a negative. You should just zero it out top to bottom, perfectly level. However, the adjustment was so easy to make that I did want to try that negative camber just to see how it feels like, because I am going high speed quite a bit with this car. Now the only thing the negative camber might affect is putting extra wear on the inside of the tread of the tire, and if that starts happening, I can always go back and zero it out as well. When I was doing this camber adjustment, I noticed that my lower sway bar link bolt was rubbing against the lower sway bar. Now this could have been because I needed that adjustment, but I went ahead and flipped this bolt around side to side to make it a little shorter, so that was less likely to happen or catch on that lower A-arm. Now when making this adjustment, I did move the A-arms out a little further, so maybe it wouldn't have hit, but by turning the bolt around, it just gave me a little bit more clearance. So that's not a possibility anyways. The only other damage I really had was my roof, so using a dead blow hammer, I straightened it out and then went ahead and put it back on. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, once again, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. The rest of this video, guys, is me installing the upper and lower A-arms on the right-hand side with a little different angle and view. So if you want to check that out, go ahead. If not, I'll see you next time. Later.